Yeah, you are.
Oh, I am? Oh, I'm being heard?
All right, hang on. Let's see if we can have you heard even better. Let me shoot this forward a little bit. Now say something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Am I being heard? Okay. Usually I can tell, but for some reason I can't tell this morning. Well, here we are again.
With Ruth.
With Ruth. I'm going to just do a little quick advertising for us. 2 weeks from today, Stan and I get to kick off in the sermon. We have a 20-minute slot. We're going to introduce you to, we're using a title that I wrote a paper on one time called The David I Never Knew. You all know about David and Bathsheba. You all know about David and Goliath. We're going to try to tell you there's so many chapters, 45 chapters in the books of Samuel, and David gets a chunk of those. And then there's those chapters in Chronicles, and David is mentioned. I don't know if anyone's mentioned more from the human level than David in Scripture, so we're going to kick that off. So a little bit about advertisement. So here we are still in Ruth. Let's went back over chapters 1 and 2. So very quickly, chapter 1 is a very depressing time in Israel, and that's why the book begins. And it's happened in the days of the judges. Very restless, uneven period of time in Israel's history. And so chapter 1 is just kind of filled with disaster after disaster.
Because people did whatever they felt was right in their own eyes.
Right. So you have the famine, you have the deaths of the three husbands, anyway, chapter 2 begins talking about hope. There's a ray of hope. There is Boaz comes into the picture, and then leading up, and then chapter 3 is what we're dealing with today. So it's a story that's very touching and moving. Ruth's name is actually, we haven't discussed her name.
Root.
It's connected with, there are two ideas that people argue about. One of them is connected with friendship, and then another actually meaning of the word coming probably from friend is affection. So it's means something like a very compassionate person, and that fits Ruth very, very well. Okay, Stan?
Yeah, this was covered this morning, but I wanted to point out one thing, and that is there in verse 1. Lots of your English translations will say a place of security or safety. Actually, the Hebrew there, one option is rest, which is interesting because rest ties to what God did on the seventh day and things being as they should be. So one thing Naomi may be saying is you need to find a husband so that your life is whole and that it's in balance and it's as it should be, so that you can have a life that's full, not a shattered or broken life by being a widow in a time when without a house to be attached to, you would be marginalized in society. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And the word there for rest is a noun of place. It can mean a rest, or it can mean a place of rest. And it's the same word from which we get the word Noah, believe it or not. But it begins with an M because it's a noun of place. So he wants her to be in a very comfortable, relaxing, restful after all the stress that they've been through.
Yeah. And so we had that there in brackets, and then I think other than that, it's pretty much the same. Just bathe yourself, rub on some perfumed oil, get dressed up, and then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let the man know that you're there until he finishes eating and drinking. And this gets a little different. When he gets ready to go to sleep, take careful notice of where he lays down. Then go uncover his legs and lie down beside him. And he'll tell you what you should do. And Ruth replied to Naomi, I will do everything you've told me to do. The previous ending line there, eating and drinking, it's more than probably just celebrating the fact that the harvest is done.
Yeah.
They've had wine to drink. They probably are a little lighter in their spirits than normal, right?
Yeah, you may wonder, what's the big boss, the owner, what's he doing there? Well, again, if you go back to the book of Judges, you'll see a lot of rage taking place, a lot of uneasiness, and so he's there to watch over the harvest and take care of the harvest. And he's not there. I mean, he's there. You know, you can't help but believe when you read the book that not only is Naomi and Ruth doing the things they ought to be doing, but Boaz is doing the thing. He's going to take care of Naomi. He's going to, he sees Ruth and sees she has need, and he just makes arrangements that she'll get that rest early. But Naomi's talking about a future, a more permanent situation.
Yeah, and don't mishear me. I want to make sure I'm clear before we move to, because we're gonna kind of hop over from the work that's being done here in just a second to the scene that will change again to where the eating and drinking has been completed. I'm not suggesting that Boaz is drunk.
Right.
I am suggesting he's in his right mind because he makes the decision to, wait, there's another family member who's closer than I am that we need to check with first. A drunk person wouldn't be able to probably figure that out, right? They wouldn't have that ready recollection and that logic if they were drunk. I'm just saying that at the end of the eating and drinking, his mood is in a very light place that would be receptive to someone showing up. Because if he was in a stern, like you're saying, the headmaster or the principal person, then anybody who breaks the rules would probably be quickly dismissed and dealt with. But at the end of the work, at the end of the night, at the end of the meal, at the end of the drinking, she shows up and he's okay with her staying. And so there is something there to that scene. And then now we're going to skip over that for a second. We'll come back to it in a few minutes. But let's talk about this threshing floor. We didn't have a lot of detail. Les just didn't have time this morning to do it. But many of us are far removed from the language in this scene. What in the world goes on at a threshing floor? What does it look like? What's the labor that's done there? Most of us do not winnow barley. And winnowing the threshed grain involves separating the kernels from the straw and the chaff. And they didn't have machines like we do today with farm implements and whatnot, so they had to use the wind in order to do this, and they had to have a place that once the wind separated it, they could distinguish what was the trash from what was the good crop product, right? And so they go to a section outside of town to do this. That's another thing you've got to recognize in this scene is she's traveling to an area that women probably normally wouldn't be at, outside the city to the threshing floor where the west wind can be used to its advantage. And so back to our reenactment pictures that we've been looking at in this study, here's where Naomi sends Ruth out and says, why don't you go down to the threshing floor, and gives her the plan. And then we see what Boaz may or may not have looked like. We looked at that picture actually last week. But here are several shots now of what it looks like to winnow barley. And I would say that you're going to get completely covered. I mean, you think mowing the grass when you've not mowed for 2 weeks and the clippings and the wind blow on you and you get all covered and itchy and whatever, but you're throwing this stuff up into the air to try to separate the food from what's discarded, right? And just look at some of these pictures, and then you jump in here with thoughts you have. I mean, you've got plumes of dust going up and an area that's going to be dirty, probably hot, sweaty because it's not easy work. And then you've got the animals there with you as well. And you can just see from these shots, there's a lot of labor involved in doing this.
Yeah, we just don't, you know, we can, those of us that are older in the auditorium here can go back to when we were children the young people, and how tough it was to farm, and everything was just so hard. And we have so many machines today doing things. On May 26th, my birthday, just a few minutes after we pulled in the garage, a hailstorm hit Franklin, ruined our roof, which was 12 years old, and David's roof, which was a bad roof anyway. We were glad to see it ruined on his house, knocked out, and did it at the top of our car that was sitting outside. The one that got in the garage wasn't dented. So anyway, we went through about a month getting it raised and all, and a company did ours, and one day they came, they delivered the shingles, and I know they delivered the shingle. We moved the car off the patio, put them there. The shingles were taken up on the roof by a machine that they have, and anyway, we had about maybe 15 workers up there working. We were locked in the house. When we didn't realize we were locked in the house, but we started to go out the front door to move one of the cars and couldn't get out. They had it blocked up, had everything covered. Could get on the breezeway, but we couldn't go out of the patio. And so I said, well, I need to go do something. I'll go move the car. I'll go through the garage. And I ran the garage, and they had the whole 4 big sheets of plywood blocking your way out. So we were actually locked in the house from 7 a.m. until 7:30 that night. And it was kind of weary feeling. Anyway, they did it one day, basically. The next morning they did some odds and ends, but one day they did that. And just used to take days and days and all that kind of stuff. So when you compare, what a farmer does today and what equipment they have compared to what ancient people had, just unbelievable.
Yeah, and it was perfect timing on the pictures now are of the equipment. So there was the process with all those different shots we went through of the winnowing and throwing up into the air. But look at some of these tools. If you and I, even today, if someone here said, well, will you and Rodney put a roof on our house today, we wouldn't get finished, even with all the modern tools. But if we had to do something like this, I don't know that I would know where to start. So, they had sifters and they had these winnowing shovels that we're going to look at here in a minute. That there's some archaeological. Yeah, there they are right there. These winnowing shovels that were like extensions of people's hands. So I guess you could scoop instead of having it stick to your hand. And I don't know what they did after they harvested this to clean it back up. But you've got dirt and sweat and all this other stuff in something that's going to eventually be your food. So that they had some tools to try to make it cleaner. Here's a picture from the tomb of Reni El Kab, where they show the workers there with a mound of some sort of grain, and they have those winnowing shovels on the end of their hands. So this is, again, something that we can verify comes from the culture at the time. And then, like a couple of weeks ago, where we looked at a different graphic relief of some work that was going on, here is the winnowing and the threshing with cattle, where they brought that would be their machine, right? They would bring the cattle in to help expedite the process. And then the baskets there on the right, returning for more grain to transport to the threshing floor. So the Egyptians did this too. This was the way of life at that time in that kind of area of the world. And then that's what a threshing floor might look like. Here's one. We've got 2 or 3. Anything you can think of to compare it to? I couldn't think of anything anybody would really know now, right?
No, I really don't think of anything.
You've got that one. You've got this one that kind of has more of a mound of the crop there in the middle. And then you have one that looks like kind of chaos, but this is maybe more like what the scene in Ruth would look like, because as was pointed out this morning in the sermon, you've got various people there that are sleeping in various areas, and you've got multiple people who are working that floor. So it might have been a busy looking place. Some places were smaller. Here's a different one that just has the threshing floor with some sledges and some winnowing forks, and a much smaller diameter there of the circle. And then there's the chaff. That's what they're saying you separate. This is just what is garbage that you just throw out after you've processed it. And then the women working, which would be what originally was happening in chapter 2 when Ruth was going along behind the women, is the women would do different jobs. They would not be at the threshing floor. One more threshing floor. So, we change scenes again. So Ruth bathes, anoints herself with perfume, and wears her best outer garments. And this is interesting because we can stop and we can stick in a contrast statement. The second sentence you see on the screen. Mourners often wore mourning attire or clothes or sackcloth, depending on what time of the Bible that we're reading, from whether it was Job up to something more modern. And they refrained from washing or using cosmetics. And there's some of the scriptures that support that claim. So some commentators are saying by doing this, dressing up and putting on perfume and looking her best, she's signaling that her time of mourning for her late husband is over and that she's now available for considering remarriage.
Right.
But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. So here we go with some different translations that I think will help you understand what I said earlier in case anybody was mishearing me. There's some different scenes here of what it might look like to have a meal that would be in celebration of the work being done. I guess I'm going to come back to that in a second. Sorry. My slides might not be in the order I seem to remember them in my head. This one troubled me. I don't know if you noticed this, but you shall observe the place where he lies and go and uncover the place of his feet and lie down. And it says here, a relief showing men sleeping next to a campfire. Well, that guy at the bottom looks very uncomfortable to me. His face is downward, yet his knee is up, and his arm is going on the top of him. I'm like, ooh, I don't think I'd wake up in a cramp if I slept like that. So I'm not exactly sure about that relief. But so she goes down to the threshing floor, which we've discovered. All right, here we come. So here is a wine press where you can see there on the right, you can see the grapes being smashed and the juice flowing out into the jug here on the left. That's one of the things we should probably consider. But here are the translation changes. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry or in good spirits. So the King James says when his heart was merry. The NIV says when he was in good spirits. And there's numerous other little small nuances there of those phrases, but pretty much the same thing. Either he's happy, merry, / joyful, or in good spirits, which all I think is what I was trying to say, is he's in a place that's a little relaxed from the hardened rules. And like Les said this morning, even though we don't, I guess this is a little backstory that Les created, but maybe he did say to the other men, even though we're finished, we're not going to party tonight, we're not going to consume a lot of wine, and we're not going to have women show up. Well, he might have said that. We don't know if he said it or he didn't. But then Ruth shows up. And so it would be potentially problematic for him and his staff if he's breaking the rules in a way that the others were not allowed to. And so when he had done this, he finds a place to lay down at the end of the heap of grain. Doesn't sound like she's coming down all pretty, proper, smelling good, bathed. He's worked all day, and he's laying down in his same work clothes and in the dust and all the dirt and all the stuff we've just looked at the end of a line of grain. That's probably about as opposite as you could get for two people who are getting ready to be in very tight quarters with each other.
Right.
So she came down softly and uncovered the place of his feet and lie down. Now, you noticed feet there. You noticed earlier on the slide I had legs. The Hebrew word seems to indicate thighs, legs area, right? Your quad muscles area. So we'll just leave it at that, but I think the screen will give us a little bit of information here on this scene. So while Ruth and Boaz did not have a sexual encounter at the threshing floor, okay, not in the possibility, not in the realm of possibility in the story. That did not happen. But there is no doubt that Ruth's actions are symbolic and constitute a marriage proposal. And I think that we would both agree with that. Les alluded to it when he said she was very bold and she was doing something that usually men did. And I would say she's doing it in a way that even men didn't do, which is she's making a very blatantly obvious statement that she would like for Boaz to consummate a marriage with her. And if we think about it, in this time, let's just say for a second the story went a little bit different way. Let's say that she comes down, they have a conversation, right? And they decide, yes, let's let the town know and our families that we're going to get married. Let's send out invitations. Let's set a day and let's rent a church auditorium or someplace to get married. That didn't happen. That was not how marriages happened. They were either arranged by family or they were consummated through the act of marriage, right? There's not all that stuff ahead of time. So if we can agree to go there, that really makes this story even more impressive. You've got a guy who's feeling really light and really good and joyful, and his work's done, and he's had a good meal, and he's had something to drink. And you have a woman making herself known that she is presenting herself for marriage. And he stops and says no, because there's another family member who's closer than him, and he needs to make sure that there's not anything that would be improper before he were to move forward. And I think we can suggest that that was probably a difficult decision to make in that moment.
Sure. Yeah, got caught by surprise by Les's word bold, because I already had planned to use the word bold. And I said, oh, Les just used my word bold. But that's really a good description of what takes place. Now, a lot of liberal authors and a lot of loose authors like to suggest, this was a sexual encounter, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That's nonsense. The text tells you several things. One is that he was a very noble person, outstanding person. It also says she was courageous in one translation, or noble, had a high reputation. And he says to her that you didn't go after the young men. Mm-hmm. And that word there is choice young men. It's from the verb to choose. You could have done that, but you could have been bold with them. But this is an awkward situation, but he makes it very clear that this is not a sexual encounter. Also, keep in mind, he didn't have to say yes. He could have said no. Mm-hmm. Maybe she doesn't know that he was. She sees this compassionate man who's reached out to Naomi, reached out to her, told his supervisors, take care of her, has broken his neck, and so he doesn't chastise her. It's got to be dark, and that's why he didn't recognize her.
And I think that proves he was honestly deeply asleep, because he's startled. Some commentators were saying maybe he woke up because of a draft, of having, he was chilled because he had been uncovered. Others just say he woke up and the last thing he would expect is for a woman to be there in his presence who wasn't there when he went to sleep. And so that startled him. And his first reaction is, who are you? You wouldn't turn on your light or have your phone and see who it is. So you would only know by voice, which he probably doesn't know her enough. And if she hasn't said anything yet, that's a fair question.
Yeah. Several times in my life, I've been awakened in the middle of the night and realized that my feet were uncovered. And the first thing that gets cold on me is my feet. Sometimes we sleep with a blanket at the bottom of the bed over my feet. And the rest of it, I'll just have a sheet on. But my feet get cold. And when my feet get cold, I can't sleep. So I think, you're right, I think what happened was he was startled and then suddenly realized he's not covered.
But for us, what's interesting is when he asked that question, let's see here. So here's the message, by the way, of that verse. Boaz had a good time eating and drinking his fill. He felt great, Peterson says. Then he went off to get some sleep and lying down at the end of a stack of barley. Ruth quietly followed and she lay down to signal her availability for marriage. And he just leaves it at that. You can fill in the blanks on what that signaling of availability is.
Right. And that's the message is very interpretive, and we have a question.
Oh, yes, sir. Right. Yeah, the question is, what if he hadn't been the noble man that he was, got caught up in the moment, went ahead and consummated a marriage to Ruth right then and there, and then the person who was closer as a kinsman's redeemer was never asked about it, what would have been the consequence of that?
Well, again, we don't have a lot of examples of what would happen, but the law was very strict about it. And today we have lawsuits and all kinds of things like that. Probably reputation, why he would have damaged himself as a reputation situation.
That's what I was going to say. It's probably a reputational damage that he would not really recover from, because that would have gone out like a shockwave, not only through the family, but through the town. And the story sets up how Boaz is, he's coming even to his field workers in chapter 2, saying blessings in the name of Yahweh, and them returning the blessing to him. He is the top echelon of the society. So it would sort of be like a black eye on, we might say, or a falling of grace a little bit if he were to skip over that. Probably wouldn't result in anybody having a death or a penalty, but would be a tarnish he would probably never get rid of, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so go ahead.
What I figured Les might go to the message. He likes to go to the message, and I had already run off something from the message, so let me just take a second to do this. She said, "I am Ruth, your maiden. Take me under your protective wing." Now, the whole idea of the wing, there are several scriptures, and Jesus even talks about like a hen taking in chicks under. The wing was a term used. It could mean a wing of a bird. It could also mean your robe, part of your robe. Skirt, like a skirt. Mm-hmm. It could mean either one of those. So there's a play on there. So the message says, "Take me under your protective wing." And we're going to come to scripture in a few minutes. I'll hold back on that. Stan put in there independently. He and I, when I saw that there, I had already thought about it also. That we'll come to later on. So you're my close relative, in the circle of covenant redeemers, in the group of, he could have said the group, and have the right to marry me. And then he responds, part of the response, "What a splendid expression of love. And when you could have had your pick of any of the young men, any of the chosen men, any of the men of rank." Anyway, then he goes ahead and says, "Everyone knows what a courageous woman," oftentimes translated, "a noble woman you are." And he dealt with that. And he's right. In my Hebrew Bible, Ruth follows right after Proverbs 31, right after that. Anyway, everyone in town knows what a courageous woman you are. A real prize. This, we'd say in modern times, a real catch. You're right. I am a close relative to you, but there is one that's closer than I am.
And I think that ties your question with your thoughts you just said, and that is that he says you could have gone after the younger, more sought after mates. So we should stop and say, well, okay, he made that statement. What does that mean? Well, that means if that's all she was interested in, it would have not been the same family line, right? If she had married one of these more attractive younger men, I threw attractive in there, maybe Boaz was attractive, I don't know. I'm just saying, clearly he's older than what he's suggesting she could have sought out after. But if she'd done that, she would have been over here in a different family, right? And if she transfers over into this other family, then she's not in the line to Jesus in the genealogy in Matthew. Right. So we should see from our position, oh, it's not just reputation, it's that something nudged her, something made her follow what the right protocol, the right path was, and she stuck to that path. And I think that's what he's saying, is you could have had anyone, and yet you're a virtuous woman, you're a noble person because you're making this commitment. You're asking me about this for all the right reasons. I'm your family member. And then he says, but there's another family member that might be closer. So I think we have to look at it that way from both sides. This is not just, Ruth's not desperate. She's not saying the first man that's available she's going to grab and marry because she's afraid to go home at night without being married to somebody immediately. She has sought out the person that would keep everything the way it's supposed to be with the bloodlines and with the family lineage, right?
Yeah, she's seen what a compassionate person Boaz is. What kind of a man this is, a caring man, and is attracted. And then Naomi sees the same thing. And so they, in total agreement, this is the guy.
Right. Interesting. So the scene, Boaz asks who she is when he is startled and wakes up. And there's a couple of Hebrew things here we wanted to point out. Ruth answers using the Hebrew word Amma. Now that might not mean anything to you, but we usually translate it to something like maiden or maid servant, something like that. And it's a more elevated term for a female servant than the word that she used in chapter 2, verse 13, which is shifkah. That describes the lowest level of female servant. See 1 Samuel 25:41. So in Ruth 2, where Ruth has just arrived from Moab and is very much aware of her position as a foreigner, in verse 10, she acknowledges Boaz's kindness and emphasizes her humility by using a term of lesser status than her rightful status of princess or na'arah. Here she comes midway. Now that she's with him, and he's aware that she's aware that he's the kinsman redeemer candidate, she elevates herself to exposing a little bit more of her status than she had at the beginning, right? And that's something that we should note as the progression of the story goes. And so we had said that Boaz was chic-like. He had the Gibor word, yet the adjective for him and the adjective for Ruth is exactly the same. We get as either wealthy or prominent or virtuous or noble, right? So Ruth admits she does not occupy that lowly position on the social scale. Here she uses the more elevated term to describe herself because she's now aware of Boaz's responsibilities as the close relative of her deceased husband. She wants to challenge him to fulfill his obligation. In her new social context, she is dependent on Boaz. However, she is no mere servant. She's not the bottom of the barrel. He's saying you could have someone else, and she's saying I'm worthy for you to have, though, too. I'm not way down here. I've actually come up to middle of the way. Here are some people that somebody was suggesting might be examples of what Boaz is saying. You could have gone after younger men. You could have gone after richer men, or you could have gone after some other person of status. And these might be examples of those people. But you did not follow the young men, whether they were rich or poor. Instead, you came here. And then something that was mentioned in the sermon this morning, I thought this was neat. Here is a tablet that is talking about the redeeming of land. This is what happens, and we're going to get into this next week when Boaz goes and sees what's his name, right? There's a name in Hebrew that actually means what's his name is what the other relative is. I'll have it in the lesson next week. I forgot.
About the kinsman redeemer? when he went to see him
Yeah,
at
yeah,
the gate.
yeah. What?
When he went to the gate to see the kinsman redeemer.
Right. That guy's name, though, the Hebrew word is something like "what's his face." You know, like it's not his real name. It's a idiom for someone you don't even bother to put their name in. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's.
Pillar.
I think I used this before when we talked about the story of Ruth back when we were doing the characters a year ago, whatever it was. But Troy O'Donohoe, some of you may remember Troy. He was in our youth group here, and Troy, along with, I think there were about 7 students, went to Lipscomb. And 5 of them were in my Bible class as freshmen. And Troy was there, and Troy became my assistant. And Troy was not really, he decided to take Hebrew. I can't remember why he decided to take it, but he didn't do very well the first term. He barely passed. We were a quarter system. We went to Israel, and he roomed with me. He got on fire. He came back and just ditched almost all of his other studies and just studied Hebrew all the time, and ended up, made a B that term, and by the spring term, he was leading the class. He passed up 2 of the best Hebrew students they ever had, a boy and a girl. Passed them up. And anyway, then that summer he took the book of Ruth. And in chapter 4, you know, we're going to come to that later.
Yeah, next Sunday.
But anyway, when Boaz goes to the gate, he says, "Hey, such and such a one," is what the Hebrew says. Mm-hmm. And then he said, "Hine, behold, the kinsman redeemer was coming through the gate." So Troy translated it on his test. Holy cow! There it was, the kinsman redeemer coming through the gate, and he said, "Hey, dude, come over here. I need to talk to you." That was his translation. And so I remember showing that to Dr. Floyd, my best friend on campus. And he said, well, one thing sure, he really understood. He had the feel for it. A little loose in his translation,
A little bit, yeah.
He had the feel for it.
Well, we'll get into that in more detail next week, but what I wanted to show you was the Leviticus 25 got mentioned in the sermon this morning, and one of the things it talks about is land, that if someone dies, and in this situation Naomi is then attached to that land, if you want the land, then you end up needing the former spouse as well. And so this is an example of that the kinsman's redeemer that's nearer, that he's going to go see, that we're going to talk about next week, when that man is faced with the situation, it's redeeming the land when lost due to hardship or death. But with that redeeming of the land comes Ruth and Naomi, which we'll talk about next week. So just interesting that here is a tablet recording an adoption through land purchase from Newsy, which is doing the same thing.
Yeah, Newsy was a site where we discovered thousands of clay tablets and written in Akkadian language, cuneiform language. And so we can go all over the ancient Near East. Next term I have a course called Archaeology in the Old Testament, PhD level. And it's just, we can't even in a term cover all of the things we found. We've actually uncovered 500,000 tablets like this, 500,000, and 90% have never been translated. There are not enough scholars to translate them. 90% still on, when we do ever get, now we probably will with artificial intelligence come along and maybe they begin to work on it already. And that may happen.
Do it faster. So she stays the night. She lay at his feet until the morning and arose, so that one could recognize another. I thought Les did a good job of explaining, just get out of here before anybody sees that you were here.
Yeah, it wouldn't tarnish your reputation.
Right. That, it'll start rumors, all kinds of other things would happen. Let it not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. That would also be problematic. And he said, bring the shawl that is on you and hold it out. And she held it out, and he pours in something. So this is interesting because I get the feeling that there's some like you said, there's maybe a little tinge of rejection feeling on how bold Ruth has been And Boaz says, wait, let's pause. Let's just take a breath and let's not do anything. Let's make sure that this is all good. By the way, don't let anybody see that you were down here. It's starting to sound pretty negative, right? Let me send you back with a gift. Let me send you back with something showing you I am legitimately saying what I'm saying. I'm saying, yes, I want to go through with this, just not immediately, and you've done nothing wrong. So let me send you back something that shows that what I'm saying is actually correct and true. And so that would be that. Now, the weight thing, Hebrew doesn't actually have a measurement, a unit of measure there. It just says 6 distributions or 6.
And we argue about
Yeah.
the size of these measurements all the time.
Right. So what happened is I looked at what Les mentioned me this morning, and I talked to him a little bit about it. What happens is you get stuck between an ephah and an omer. And omers seem like they'd be too light if you only had 6 of those, and ephahs seem like they'd be way too heavy. They'd be over 100 pounds. So would someone saddle a little woman with over 100 pounds and say, here, I really like you, go home, hope you make it, with, and no, probably not. And then would it be much of a gift if it was just, well, here's some crumbs, you can have those. So it's somewhere in between. I don't know. Some translations say 30 pounds, some say 60 pounds. I think they're guessing. They don't really
guessing.
know. Yeah.
Clearly a nice amount. Clearly.
Yes. Clearly something that makes a statement. And so he goes into the city, and he's going to go find out what to do with this other gentleman that we will talk about next week. And she heads home and shows Naomi what she has. And then she says to her, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. And some translations, I think, do this a little bit better. Oh, he won't rest until he gets this matter resolved. I'm like, you've done a well enough proposal that it's not going to leave his mind or his to-do list. There's not going to be anything else that gets in the way. He's going to go take care of this. And that's what we'll look at next week. But here's what it did for me and you. Anytime you can use the Bible to interpret the Bible, it's better than what you think it says, right? Like I can read something and say, well, I bet what this is X or Y. But if you can use the Bible to find exactly the same thing that's very clear on what it is there, and then you can probably apply it to somewhere else. So what we did is we went to Ezekiel 16, verse 8 and 9, but really just 8 is all we need to be completely clear. The Hebrew phrasing is identical to Ruth chapter 3, verse 9. What Ruth says to Boaz is what Yahweh says to Israel in Ezekiel 16. Just listen to this. Then I passed by you and watched you, noticing that you had reached the age for love. I spread my cloak, or my skirt, or my wing, over you and covered your nakedness. I swore a solemn oath to you and entered into a marriage covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. That's what Ruth's asking Boaz to do. And she says it just like that. So next week we'll look at how Boaz resolves the issue standing between him and Ruth getting married, because he has clearly had a marriage proposal from Ruth that is unmistakably clear, and he's wanting to make sure that he doesn't do anything improper to take her up on her proposal.
It's amazing that we both came up with that same scripture in Ezekiel. And when I saw Stan had it in there, I said, great.
Yeah.
And I was going to put it in.
Yeah, so the week ahead, we could say sometimes God, the Holy Spirit, nudges us through our thoughts, our dreams, and the voices of others. And when it is time to take action like Ruth did, may we have the courage to pursue what is in God's will, even when it is risky, because it was definitely risky for Ruth. The whole situation, as you can probably now see clearly, was risky. When we find ourselves in Boaz's position, may we prayerfully consider our options before we act. That, I think, is the story kind of there of chapter 3 of Ruth, is you've got a bold presentation that's risky, and you have somebody who wants to act on it that is prayerfully considering, but before I do, I need to make sure that I have done very good discernment with what the Lord would ask me to do. And so we end with this simple prayer, shorter this week. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the scriptures pointing to our kinsman redeemer, the risen Savior, and coming bridegroom, Jesus the Messiah. May we wait on Jesus as Ruth waited on Boaz. We pray in Jesus' name.